The industrial city of Detroit, Michigan is one of the oldest cities in the American Midwest. It is currently the second largest city in the Midwest behind only Chicago. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, it covers an area more than 138 square miles and includes a population of more than 670,000 citizens. It has been called the motor vehicle capital of the world and is occasionally called the Paris of the Midwest. But few people recall the city's humble founding, a fortification that covered an area just 60 foot square, and even fewer know the story of the extraordinary visionary who had an idea of a city way off in what was then the wildlands of the New World. The story of Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, the founder of the city of Detroit, deserves to be remembered. He was born Antoine Lamont in March 1658 at Saint-Nicolas-le-Grave, France, the fourth child in his family. They were not wealthy, and Antoine joined the military to advance his career and education. Later in his life, Cadillac made enemies in the French court who claimed that he left France for the New World and changed his name because he was a criminal concealing a shadowy past. Prominent Canadian historian Agnes Lowe disagrees. Lowe writes that in his father's will, Cadillac's father revealed one of his sons had spent most of the family's fortune, leaving only $500 for each of the rest of the children, including Cadillac. He left the wayward son, who was not Cadillac, no money in his will, but only a curse. Other historians claim that it was Cadillac's father, a lawyer, who lost an important trial, and the family's financial difficulties stemmed from that misfortune rather than any misbehavior by wayward sons. But in any case, that is what drove Cadillac to seek his fortune in the New World. As for the name change, Lowe believes it has less to do with criminality and more about Cadillac's desire to remember the area of the world where he was from. The name Cadillac is a town in southwestern France. Whatever the case, Cadillac came to the New World, landing at Port Royal in Acadia in 1683. He was 25 years old and an explorer, observing the land and people that was then called New France. Cadillac sent his observations back to the King of France, Louis XIV, otherwise known as the Sun King, at his palace in Versailles. Communications back and forth from the New World to Europe took almost 2 years round trip, made it nearly impossible for the agents of Louis XIV to execute their monarch's wishes in a timely manner or even know what those wishes were. Some agents of the crown took advantage of this time gap to pursue their own interests, and then, when they were caught, begged forgiveness later. Cadillac's detractors claim he was one of those types, but again other historians disagree, saying he was a man of his times, ambitious, and unwilling to ask permission of others for his behavior. Cadillac was known to the king and his ministers, but without a wealthy family behind him, he lacked the resources to be a familiar face at Versailles. There were requirements about how one was to dress when approaching the king, among a host of other rules concerning etiquette and precedence. But the king valued Cadillac's letters because, unlike many others, he would not hold back his opinions in order to curry favor. And one of those opinions was a pragmatic appraisal of the French holdings in the New World, which were then called New France, which Cadillac did not think would ever become as established as the mother country. He wrote to the king, "The world may revolve on its axis for all eternity, but Canada will no more become a France, as a desert will become a garden." He wrote scathingly of the Jesuits stationed in New France, who were highly critical of his behavior, describing them as puppies barking at his heels, and saying that he had no time to address their concerns, which included trading alcohol with the Native Americans. While he was often accused of this crime, he contended that the others, including the Jesuits, were doing the same. The Jesuits had come to the New World to save the souls of the Native American tribes, acting as missionaries and educators. One of the most important Native American groups in the area at the time was the Iroquois Confederacy, which was composed initially of 5 different tribes: the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Mohawk. The tribes of North America near the Great Lakes sometimes fought viciously among themselves over slights like the kidnapping of one of their members by a neighboring tribe. The British and French took advantage of this infighting to support their own campaigns to claim as much land and resources as possible. They engaged in trade wars, trading muskets, ammunition, and alcohol for Native American furs. It behooved the Native Americans to befriend the Europeans, as a well-made musket gave a notable advantage over one's enemies. Cadillac had an unfavorable view of the Native Americans, writing to his superiors that they often played the fox, but never the lion, and that the Jesuits' efforts to Christianize them were in vain. He wrote, "One may as well knock one's head against the wall as hope to convert the Indians in any way," and counseled that the best way to colonize the frontier was to encourage the soldiers to take Native American wives, and then to educate the children in European customs and religions. In his own personal life, Cadillac married Marie Theresa, the daughter of a merchant, in Quebec in June 1687. They would go on to have 7 sons and 6 daughters, although only 3 of their children would outlive them. Marie Theresa was a distant relation to Antoine the Duc de Luzon, who was very well connected at Versailles, and which would serve Cadillac well. Cadillac was also assisted in his career by Louis de Beau de Frontenac, the Governor-General of New France, who acted as the king's representative in the New World. Frontenac was a headstrong governor, battling with the local religious authorities and the Sovereign Council, New France's governing body. He employed Cadillac to canvass the area and the coast, looking for strategic locations for trade and defense, always seeking to increase France's foothold in North America. Cadillac himself made trips back and forth from the New World to the Old, giving reports and advancing his career through service to France's Secretary for the Navy, Count Pontchartrain. He was appointed commander of the fort at Michilimackinac, a post which Cadillac seemed to enjoy for both its opportunity and its beauty. Cadillac wrote, "It is always healthy at Michilimackinac. This may be attributed to the good air or to the good food, but it is better to attribute it to both. Certain proof of the excellence of the climate is to see the old men there, whose grandsons are growing gray, and it would seem as if death had no power to carry off these specters." He was eventually made commander of all the stations in the upper countries of New France, and it was then that he proposed the idea of building a fortification at the location that would eventually become Detroit, as the perfect place to control the fur trade on the Great Lakes. To create an outpost like Detroit, Cadillac needed a commission and permission from the king. Frontenac wrote a letter alongside Cadillac's request, putting his support behind the idea and Cadillac himself. In one of Frontenac's last letters to the king, he wrote, "It is impossible to be more pleased than I am with the vigilance, good conduct, and adroit management of the Chevalier Mothe Cadillac." And that opinion held weight. Frontenac had fought to maintain control over Quebec for years from both the Native American tribes and the English, notably pushing back the English force of William Phipps in 1690. Frontenac died on November 28, 1698, but Cadillac would receive his commission. He traveled to Versailles to receive it from the king's own hand in 1700. He received permission, but no money to fund his venture, beyond pay for the soldiers, forcing him to find creative solutions for funding. Cadillac promised soldiers farmland in exchange for their assistance in building and defending Detroit. On the way to the site, Cadillac's soldiers and Native American guides were stirred into discontent by traders along the way to the new settlement, who said that Cadillac would not be able to maintain order on the frontier. Cadillac quelled the potential mutiny by drawing his sword and challenging anyone who believed he couldn't lead a successful settlement to a duel. No one took Cadillac up on his challenge, but some historians say that his hat was knocked off during an argument, which was a particular insult to Cadillac because he preferred his clothing and appearance to be impeccable at all times. Cadillac and his men arrived at what would become Detroit in July of 1701. Once at the location, they started construction of a fort, but the first building completed was a church, St. Anne's Roman Catholic Church. It would go on to be the second oldest continually operating Catholic parish in the United States. Cadillac called the settlement Fort Pontchartrain Le Detroit, with Detroit referring to the straits of the nearby Great Lakes. As the position of his new settlement was precarious, Cadillac encouraged the Ottawa, Huron, Potawatomi, Miami, and Wyandot people and others to settle near it, finding strength in numbers. Cadillac loved his location as much as he had adored Michilimackinac. He wrote to the king, "The meadows need only the plowshare to grow anything." He described the climate as milder than Quebec, with no cold winds. He also noted the numerous animals and birds, saying they were greater in number than any private French park, and unafraid of men. Through careful management and creative diplomacy, the new settlement of Detroit flourished under Cadillac. Numbers are hard to come by because the city's records were destroyed in a fire in 1704, but it appears that settlers, herds, and crops increased incrementally each year in Detroit. And in February of 1704, Cadillac's wife gave birth to a daughter, the first known European baby born in the new settlement. In June 1706, a dog owned by one of the French soldiers at the settlement bit one of the Native Americans, and that caused a fight between the two groups. The priest at St. Anne Church, Father Nicholas de la Hall, and 30 of the Native Americans were killed. Cadillac settled the situation once more, but it demonstrated that not all was peaceful on the frontier. Nor were things peaceful back in France. Cadillac was accused by his enemies of misbehavior at Detroit. Perhaps jealous of his success, they said he was trading alcohol to the Native Americans for pelts, which he most likely was. They said he was stealing from the importers of goods, and that was the only reason the settlement was doing so well. Cadillac pushed back, saying that if he was accused of all these things, an agent should come to investigate him and clear his name. The charges were dropped in 1705. But then an agent arrived in 1707 and said, among other things, that Cadillac was abusing his power by charging settlers to rent out his horse. Cadillac's seemingly mammoth successes and financial increases at Detroit had come back to haunt him, as Count Pontchartrain, formerly Cadillac's ally at court, said he was charging too much rent to the settlers at the fort and was profiting too much. But the criticism did not seem to put him out of favor with the king, because the king instead decided to give Cadillac even more authority. Louis XIV named Cadillac the governor of the Louisiana Territory, and in 1710 Cadillac was ordered to move south. But Cadillac was never satisfied in the Louisiana Territory, and he lobbied to return to France, which he was eventually allowed to do in 1717. Upon returning to Paris, he was thrown into the Bastille for 5 months for unclear reasons. Some historians argue that his imprisonment was for saying treasonous things about the king, but others say it was because his son had claimed that there were minerals to be mined in the territory where there were not. But upon his release, he was decorated with the prestigious Order of St. Louis. He died near his birthplace in Castel-Sarrazin, France. Cadillac was 72 years old. Although Detroit has lost quite a lot of population from its height, it is still the largest city on the border between the United States and Canada. It's had its problems with bankruptcies, city services, abandoned buildings, and crime, but it has a long history of innovation in both culture and industry, including, of course, the luxury car brand that bears its famous founder's name. And you could say that that culture of innovation goes all the way back to a man who saw a spot between two rivers and imagined a city of commerce and industry. A man who didn't back down to people who were more politically connected than he was, and who, through grit and determination, founded the first major European settlement in the American Midwest. Detroit is sometimes called the Paris of the Midwest, owing to its French colonial heritage, the French influence on its architecture, and the fact that both cities are designed around large radial avenues. And that is fitting, because Cadillac once said that he hoped that his Le Detroit would become the Paris of New France. And it's not hard to see that he accomplished, in many ways, exactly that. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.